This is on community living skills and outdoor mobility, and it's based on our clinical tips for occupational therapists, which is a summary of guidance information from the best practice guidelines for occupational therapists working with people with Huntington's disease. So why are we talking about this? Well, outdoor access is better for overall well-being for all of us, but particularly for people with neurological conditions and their companions. And if people aren't able to access the outdoors, then it affects their well-being. Why is this? Well, it's about access, it's about suitable and affordable transport, and it's about lack of adequate support, perhaps due to the severity of symptoms. And then I've added this last bit, and I know that we might be all extremely COVID tired, but actually it's also about not being able to do or practice. And if we think about the effects of lockdown on our loved ones, we will notice that they may have become deconditioned and their health has suffered as a consequence. And that is certainly my clinical experience and the experience of my colleagues and the experience of the I work with. So it's really important that as a group of professionals and family members, whoever's out there today, hello, because I don't know where you might be from, that we actually sort of try and see if we can address this. And this is really important in terms of advocating for folk with HD and families, but also educating ourselves so that we can advocate for them and break down stigma and get people's needs met. If you are an occupational therapist and you've attended the Royal College of OT's conference this week, one of the big messages was about inclusion and equity of services. And in my experience, people with HD and their families really struggle with that because people struggle to understand HD, which is why we're doing these things. Okay. So this is just a slide to refresh, and it's very similar to our slide a couple of weeks ago about changes in community functioning and why that might be. And it's very similar to the changes in social functioning that we mentioned a couple of weeks ago when we dealt with social activity. The HD specific changes are due to cognition. So our thinking should be very much around, okay, what's going on with this person's cognition? It's also about behavior, and behavior does change with HD. There can be problems with impulsivity. There can be problems with agitation. It can also be problems with mood, and all of these things, by the way, are connected. They're all interconnected, and that's really important to understand. They don't sit in silos with HD. There's all this interconnectivity between all of these issues. Problems with mobility, I mean, that's usually the most obvious thing, isn't it? Due to the movement and due to problems with balance and coordination. So therefore people become quite anxious and there's fear of falling. But there's also frustration, but there's also lack of awareness and lack of insight. Problems with movement in and of itself. So movement that causes injury. Movement that causes problems with seating, with wheelchair provision. There are sensory changes. So actually a person might become hypersensitive to the environment, and therefore noisy environments cause agitation or anxiety. So again, all of this interconnectivity between systems. And then I think really, really importantly, and we often forget about it in HD land, is physical and emotional fatigue. So folk with HD are literally running, maybe we're on an energy level running about, a marathon a day, but they're running 3 or 4 marathons a day with regards to their energy requirements. So we need to consider all of those things, and all of those things will be causing changes in community function. So the person is still there, but actually these are the issues that they've now got to contend with as well. and we need to be aware of those things. Okay, so I think I'm going to hand over to Kirst, because even though Kirst works in mainly in nursing homes, one of the main things that she can facilitate activity with is around assessment of road safety skills, and she's got some really lovely stories there.
So thank you, Alex. Safety. So as Alex has talked about, we've got all the changes that happen with Huntington's disease, and the most obvious really is the mobility and the movements when we're looking at someone in the community. However, what we observe to do with mobility might not actually be the changes in someone's mobility, but their cognitive changes and their behavioural changes. So assessment of road safeties, as an occupational therapist, as a physio would, I'd be looking at someone's physical ability to navigate uneven surfaces, to navigate a curve, to cross a road at a fairly good pace to get across. But within that, we also need to start thinking about cognitively, is someone able to manage everything else that's happening in their environment? Recognize a car's coming, recognize the speed a car's coming, being able to plan the right point in time to step off the curve and cross the road, to not be distracted when doing that. And I smile when I say that. I worked recently with a lovely lady who had a really good verbal demonstration that she knew had good road safety. So she knew to stop at the road, she knew to stop at the curve, before stepping onto the road. She knew to look left and right. However, if there was someone walking past on the other side of the road with a dog, and all of that went out the window, and all she was interested in was getting across the road to see that dog. She was really impulsive and really distractible. So physically, she could cross the road quite safely, but actually cognitively and behaviourally, I felt that she needed to be on a one-to-one to maintain her safety. We put footwear there in terms of safety when in the community. Good fitting, sturdy footwear is what we recommend. This is for someone who's walking. I know of people who are no longer walking and in a wheelchair. I know one lady, when she wanted to go out in her wheelchair, she would come in. Okay. She would want to wear her heels. And we had a big conversation as a team about, was it safe to wear her heels? But actually in the community, she was staying in her wheelchair. She wasn't getting out. For her, she wanted to look nice and feel good in the community. So actually her footwear wasn't applicable for that risk assessment. We want to cover transfers and transports and thinking about posture and also risk. I was saying to Alex today, I've worked with people who are beginning to deteriorate and needing a wheelchair for the community, but still going into the community, and we're having to look at how they're getting into the community. Are they being pushed by a carer or a family member? How easy that is for that person? Or are we getting in and out of car? Or are we using a wheelchair adapted vehicle? It's really challenging as an OT. I've certainly found it challenging as an OT, speaking to families and people with Huntington's disease at the point of them needing much more postural support. So for example, someone who can now no longer manage their posture in a standard wheelchair can no longer safely, even with two people, stand to transfer into a car. As soon as we start bringing in a wheelchair that's offering postural support, such as tilting space, then we can no longer fold that wheelchair up to go into a car. So they're quite challenging conversations to have, because you're taking away the independence not only for the person with HD, because you're thinking about their safety, but you're taking away that independence for families as well. And we as OTs, we have to think about safety of families and carers when transferring. Alex, you want to talk about driving, aren't you? You've got more experience than I in terms of driving.
Okay, well, you talk about transitioning to immobility if that's happening for the individual, but actually, again, cognitive changes and motor changes, but specifically cognitive changes and behavioral changes might cause problems with driving skills. And of course, this is at the point where actually we need to be, as occupational therapists, mindful of this. So I think we often think about mobility in terms of walking, in terms of wheelchairs, but we don't tend to think of it in terms of this individual driving, and we need to be aware of that, and who we might, if we're not feeling confident in reporting it ourselves, who we are reporting it to. Okay, so if a person has been advised by a GP or advised by a consultant who is overseeing their HD, then that person is required to tell the DVLA of their diagnosis and also tell the insurance company of their diagnosis. But of course, lots of people fear losing their independence, so quite naturally they're reticent about that, or might be quite insightless and therefore don't do it and don't see why they should do it. So there are other mechanisms by which professionals can report. So there's a really, really great toolkit. I think it's called the Assessing Fitness to Drive, a guide for medical practitioners, that's available from the DVLA, which guides you through this. For those of you who are out there that are watching this, the DVLA is our driving and vehicle licensing authority in the UK. And what they will do is they will, if that person does choose and tell the DVLA, then they will write to the GP and consultant and say, okay, what's your opinion here? And they will set certain parameters to the license of that person, which might include being reviewed every year, being reviewed every 3 years. They might say, actually, we want you to stop driving until you've gone to a regional driving assessment centre, which is sort of a county-based assessment centre where there are driving assessors and occupational therapists who will look at that person's ability. And depending on what they say, they will send a letter back to the GP or to the DVLA with their recommendations. So there are lots of different processes, which is why it can get really, really confusing for people. But it's quite clear when you visit the guidelines what to do. What actually happens on the ground is often not that simple. So I've had people who've refused to hand over their keys even to the police and say, there's not a judge in the land that's going to tell me to stop driving. And unfortunately, it gets really, really emotional and really, really messy, but it does get sorted eventually. I've had ambulance drivers hiding people's keys, all kinds of stuff. I also get family members who are actually, my goodness, if this person stops driving, what on earth are we going to do? And I think it's really, really important to address this issue early on. If you're seeing cognitive changes and motor changes, which might indicate that this person is not safe and they're impulsive, for example, and they can't multitask, these are the kinds of things, these are the kinds of skills that you actually need when you're driving. And it's really important to start to sort of raise it sensitively so that maybe a person can transition with sensitivity to using public transport. And I know that that is an issue in and of itself in this country too. Again, as is stigma, as is social anxiety. So we've got this big circle of things. I've put police on here because they're pretty good, they're pretty understanding. And actually, sometimes I've actually had to liaise with the police and say, this person is refusing to do this. And they will say, well, okay, is their car off the road at the moment? I'll say, yeah. And they'll say, well, okay, if they if they get in the car and they drive and they're picked up on an ANC camera, then actually we will immediately stop them and we will probably do the rest. So there are lots of agencies that will become involved, and you may be asked to comment at that point. I put cognition and capacity on here because I think, you know, as OTs, there are lots of things that perhaps if you've never come across somebody with Huntington's disease, you might shy away from all of these kinds of things because people can be very plausible for a very short period of time. And often it's the executive capacity, it's what goes on online and in real life that you're going, oh, hold on a second, they're saying this thing, but actually they're doing this thing. What on earth are we going to do here?
And Alex, that's exactly what I was saying with my lady. She had such a lovely way of describing exactly what she was going to do, where she was going to go, how it was going to work. And then when it came to actually doing the task, impulsivity and distraction took over. But sitting down and doing a paper interview and a capacity assessment, she looked like she would pass. But actually, when you took her out into the real world, into the community, it was very different.
Social workers now are asking us for executive capacity assessments because they're recognising this, which is actually a step forward. And they're also recognising fluctuating capacity as well, which is just as important in this case. And the Mental Capacity Act, for those of you who like a little bit of bedtime reading, does cover all of these things. Includes the fact that you can look at behaviour if you've exhausted everything else and used least restrictive practices and optimised as best you can. Oh, hello, there's another.
Okay, Andrew, we do love you, Andrew, for your inputs. That's a great example Kirsty has given with her lady. Okay, so it's just reminding us that someone can give us a really good face-to-face example of how they can pass a capacity assessment potentially, and then when we see in reality, in practice, in function, as OTs like to do, actually see someone doing a functional activity, that's where we see the cognitive changes. Thank you for your comments, Andrew, we do appreciate them.
Okay, and finally then we've got being able to call for help and getting lost. So I mean, nowadays most folk do have some form of tracking on their mobile phone. So with consent, you know, have that conversation about, can we put this on your device? Who would you call? Perhaps you can program in case of emergencies, an ICE contact, for example, into the phone. And different phones have different functions. So some do have an SOS button, for example. Some you have to program in an ICE. But again, just including in your intervention, including in your assessment, being aware of those types of things, certainly. Because what we don't want to do is, we don't want to necessarily stop people going out. And in the community, certainly for me, you know, I can't legally do anything about it. However, if I've got together with my colleagues, MDT, and if we think that this person lacks capacity, then we can put together under the best interest framework the least restrictive care plan possible, although sometimes we do legally have to be restrictive. I think there's this element of gosh, let's be as least restrictive as possible, totally get that, but we also must remember that our job is ultimately to try and protect this person from harm as well.
I think the other thing we can add under the safety heading, but it goes throughout, is our risk assessments are a fluid, changing assessment, as we all change daily, and particularly with people with Huntington's disease, how they present on one day could be different to the next. So it's a lot to factor in. So we do quite dynamic. If I'm taking someone out into the community, I'll be risk assessing the day before when I'm doing my planning, and then I'm risk assessing that morning when I come into work, finding out from the carers, the nurse in charge, how someone's been that day. And then prior to going out, I'm risk assessing again. Has anything changed? Has behavior changed? Has fatigue changed? Or is that person hungry? It's an ongoing assessment that we're doing, as well as writing it on paper when we're thinking about taking someone new for the first time. It's also that what's the word, Alex, that ongoing assessment that we're doing. Dynamic, that's the word. Thank you.
let me be dynamic and find the dynamic word. Okay, so we'll move on here to the next one. So again, this looks a bit random, by the way, these headings, but these are about the things that we considered in community in our clinical tips, because other bits had been discussed elsewhere in the social tips, for example. So community living skills, again, advocating and breaking down stigma, but also in your toolbox, you should have knowledge of local schemes such as shop mobility, which I've noticed is coming back, albeit people cleaning wheelchairs frantically. And then being aware of things like toileting, so the National Key Scheme, which we mentioned last time, and places that have changing places, so changing rooms which have the facility to enable adults to actually use the toilet in a more dignified way, or actually have manual handling facilities within them, such as ceiling track hoists, for example, so that carers and companions can go out with that individual. So well worth gemming up on those. Again, last time I think we spoke about, somebody had asked us what was our experience with Dial-A-Ride and those kinds of things, and for me it's been very, very positive. But again, and I think we mention it in one of the next slides, what you actually do is you engage with the service locally and say, I have a person with HD, this is their presentation. Obviously you're trying to do this with consent if you can. How would it be, and what do they need to do, and what support mechanisms do they need to access this Dial-A-Ride scheme? Now, drivers change all the time, so actually you might have to scattergun for a few times, but it's worth doing it. Let's not forget things like bus passes. Again, really, really great if people will use them, and again, if people are transitioning from driving to not driving, so that's a really important thing right there. And they're also very much these sort of local postcode policies for these things. So they'll be different in different areas. Blue badge scheme. Okay, so this is a scheme for individuals that have a visible disability or an invisible disability, because not all folk with HD have movement problems. That can be applied from the local authority. You might need to get the GP to fill in a form, or it might be a local OT to fill in the form. There is a little cost attached to that, but again, well worth exploring that. And again, in some areas they're saying now, well, you actually have to have top rate PIP, so that's personal independence payment, in order to be able to access it. So that in itself is an issue too, because I appreciate that this is an ongoing issue for folk with HD, although the HDA have been terrific at advocating with the Department of Work and Pensions about this. So hopefully that landscape is getting a little bit better. Wheelchair accessible taxis. So early on, Kirst spoke about, people transitioning from mobility to immobility and the sensitive discussions around wheelchairs. And actually, if, for example, your family vehicle won't take a fold-up wheelchair and this person's transitioning to quite a big, bulky chair, you might actually need to consider using the mobility element of the PIP to go to a mobility scheme car dealer so that actually you can have a car that takes a wheelchair. So again, lots of considerations, but there are wheelchair accessible taxis. And my best tip for finding one is actually go to your local authority web page and to search wheelchair accessible taxis, and there will be recommended wheelchair accessible taxi services. I've done this recently with my mum, so I'm quite familiar with it, and it does work quite well. Okay, so I know that we're talking about community access and social access, but if a person that you're working with doesn't have family or companions that wish to get involved in this form of support, then this person is entitled, if they consent, or actually even if they don't, again, it's about capacity, to have a care assessment under the, needs-based assessment under the Care Act. So don't forget that. And part of their needs are social needs. So it's not just about personal care support. It should include social needs and community needs. Okay, Kirsty has said about taking people out into the community, and she's got a lovely one in a moment, I think, coming up. Prepare an outing protocol for most eventualities. Thing is with HD is that you think you've got it down pat and then something else happens. Okay, but you've done your best is where I'm at with it. And then again, factor in risk, cognition and capacity. What's your lovely story, Kirst?
Well, my story was actually thinking about what the goals are, what's the outcome that we want from a community activity. And that might not always marry what we think as a healthcare professional, or from my experience, from what a carer thinks they're offering a resident, to actually what the person with HD wants from a session, an activity. And I was describing to Alex a fantastic lady that I worked with who liked clothes shopping. She liked shopping prior to having Huntington disease diagnosis. She dressed really well, was really cared about what she looked like, what she wore. And clothes shopping was still an activity that she really enjoyed. What wasn't so important for her was budgeting. Spending time looking for the right clothes, the right sizes. She had real problems with monitoring her behaviour and impulsivity, but we didn't want to stop her from shopping. So we risk assessed, and actually because of her impulsivity and poor self-monitoring, we felt she needed a 2-to-1 to go into the community. But we didn't want to prevent her from doing something which she clearly enjoyed, which was clothes shopping. And the example I gave Alex was taking her into Primark and taking her around the clothes rails, and if she saw something she liked, and she loved leopard print style clothes, she knew exactly what she liked. If she saw something, she grabbed, her eyes lit up, she wanted it. And there was no negotiation. It wasn't worth having a conversation about, you can't afford it, it's not the right size, it's the wrong time of year to be buying that. If she wanted it, she wanted it. So we would allow her to pick an item, and then as we went around the shop, we'd hold them for her, and then we would do the monitoring. We would look at what she's got and pull out the bits which would fit her, and we'd manage her budgeting. And what we had at the end of the session was 2 really tired carers running around after her, putting the shop back together as she was grabbing clothes. But for her, she got to the till with an armful of clothes which were appropriate for her. She was able to hand over the money with our facilitation, so she was interacting and taking part in the process. And then back on the unit, the enjoyment you could see from when she came back from her trip, and the staff coming and sharing that moment of, what have you brought? Isn't that lovely? Holding it up against her. And the whole social element of shopping was really important. So that's what I mean by, what are the expectations of the activity? And we've talked before about breaking down a task and making sure the task is meaningful. And to the end of the time that I worked with her, going shopping wasn't an appropriate activity, but she had a wardrobe full of clothes, and she still was interested in watching us tidy her wardrobe, talking about what she had on. That hadn't gone, although we couldn't actually do the community sessions. So I guess what I'm saying is, think about what's important with an activity. I think I talked about a different example, Alex, about a lady who we'd take her to go and buy food from the shop, but actually what she really wanted was to buy chocolate puddings. And some weeks she would choose, other weeks she wouldn't. But actually back on the unit, that was one of the few foods she was eating towards the end of her life. And it was really important to give her some choice and some element of choosing. And it had an impact on her behaviour on the ward, impact on her eating. And she had her own fridge stocked with chocolate puddings. And there was no discussion. I couldn't discuss with her, you've already got 20 items, you don't need any more. That wasn't relevant to her. The actual process of going out and having a choice was what was really important to her.
No, I mean, for folk living in the community, obviously, it can be markedly different. It can be the same. There are folk living at home with companions and carers who are having that experience. But we are, I guess we're saying with forethought and at least knowing, because I think sometimes when we talk about these things, I think I said to you this morning, it can be a bit abstract when we're just talking about it in terms of our clinical tips. But actually when you give examples, people go, oh yeah, actually that happens to me as well. And I guess what I'm saying is, by talking about it, we know that actually in our role and in our other colleagues' roles, that they can then use these sources of support to get support for people, so that we can get this consistency of support for people as well, because it does seem really varied and really marked. But I know, again, issues of consent, letting people even in through the door. So a couple of weeks back when we had somebody who said, I can't get in, and I just said, just keep trying, keep plugging away. Sometimes it takes me 6, 7, 8 times just to get through the door, and that's worth it. That's really worth the time. And if you've got a good manager in your team, it's really worth saying that too.
I think I was going to say, Alex, my experience is very different, and it's more of finding out what someone is interested in. And when I've done any outcome measures on what activities I've been offering my residents, I've always found that community-based outdoor activities show a higher level of well-being than indoor group type activities. Whether that's the stimulation of being outside, whether it's because I'm getting the activity right. But when I talk about activities, for some people that could just be going to the local park and getting an ice cream and coming back. It hasn't got to be this huge community activity of planning a trip to the seaside or the zoo, although they're good. They've been good trips that I've been involved in as well, but it could just be as simple as, I had one gentleman, we used to go to the local cafe, for a hot chocolate loaded with cream and flakes and marshmallows. And that was what he found really enjoyable.
Here we've got our next bit, which is about planning. And this is mainly, and we've broken it down a little bit into, okay, so number one, there's leaving the house. And because we know that folk with HD have got cognitive problems, then actually, again, as an OT, maybe you need to be thinking about, or sorry, any other workers out there or family members, actually things like, okay, they go out without their keys, they go out without their wallet, they go out without ID. And it's actually, okay, what can you do before they leave the house that actually prompts them to that? Now, there are such things as sensors, which you can then record information, but for me, actually, they're often too late and the person can't attend to two things at once unless you point it out. The standard for me actually is a great big sign that says, have you got? And it is, you know, the spectacles, the wallet, the watch, and those things that person needs to go out that door. And let's return to some of the sort of things that we've spoken about previously, is that people really respond well with HD, really respond well to planning and to routine and to habits. And also that takes the pressure off them to actually think about it. So that in itself is optimizing engagement and safe engagement. Have we had a bit of a flash of Q&A?
Yeah. So Andrew has counted several HD community patients who are socially phobic or almost agoraphobic. So that's the other side of the coin, isn't it?
Yeah, and I think we spoke about that the other week, didn't we? That extreme social anxiety and that needing to be in the house for safety. That's shelter. That's exactly it. And so again, I suppose what Kirsten and I is, you know, we tend to, as occupational therapists, we tend to be, yes, activity is everything, but actually that sensitivity and that knowledge that social anxiety may actually be a thing, and actually we need to respect that, because there's this balancing act here between pushing and pushing and pushing and people disengaging and disengaging and disengaging, and then become frustrated and agitated, and then there are risks involved with that too.
But it's certainly in
fallen in the community, being accused of being drunk in the community, and therefore absolutely reinforced that need for shelter and comfort at home. Yeah.
I was going to say, in the care home setting, I've seen people who haven't been out, and it's just really important to keep asking and change how you ask. I remember someone who hadn't been out for a long time. Finally, the day I went in and took the wheelchair, got his jacket out of the wardrobe without giving him a choice and saying, "Let me help you," was a day that actually he tried to sit up. And that cued him in.
Yeah.
So
yeah, and that's an interesting
in that
one,
situation, was it apathy? Was it approach? You know, but we didn't give up on him, and he did go out and did enjoy it. And the next time it didn't work. So it's trying different.
Yeah, I mean, I do, you know, often it's about us, as you've said, and it's not about them, you know, our interventions, and we've got to be mindful of that. And it's interesting because, again, a couple of weeks back, didn't we, we said introducing change, you can either introduce it gradually over time and one thing at a time, or actually sometimes that doesn't work with people at all. And actually what does work is actually not letting them know about change, and then literally saying, right, today, concretely, without abstract, this is what we're doing. And that works too. And I know in the community that's a really fine line for practitioners, because they've only got so much time and resource. But, you know, some practitioners have more understanding systems than others. But it's, again, it's putting it out there that we have had these experiences and these are the things that we might try. So it's leaving the house or not leaving the house. But also part of leaving the house is, okay, leaving the house can be massive in and of itself. There's steps to negotiate, there's slippy pathways, there's, you know, the path up to the road. Again, you know, we can get involved and we can make sure that there are appropriate grab rails, access, persons transitioned to a wheelchair, ramps, those kinds of things. So that needs to be thought about. Planning routes and trial runs. This is very much about transitioning to public transport or to other forms of transport. Trying it out yourself and seeing what the risks might be and what the eventualities might be part of your planning and might be part of your intervention, so that you know that if the individual that you're working with is hypersensitive to noise, for example, what's the best time of day to go? How many changes are there going to be on this route? Those kinds of things. Where are the nearest toilets? One of the massive things in the community skills wise, is actually the handling of money. I've just literally been off the phone to somebody's loved one who said actually their family member with HD, somebody got hold of their card details and have taken thousands of pounds worth of monies out of their bank account. So again, you know, this is about handling of money as in change, as in monies, as in small monies, but money as in large monies. Executive function is the ability to be able to organize oneself, and actually handling money comes under executive skills. So I'm sorry, I mean executive, i.e. brain management of money, as well as motor management and handling of money. So we've got the two with HD. We've got folk who'll go into a shop with a fiver and just put it on the counter and have a trust relationship with the shopkeeper that they're going to give back the right monies. And sometimes they do, and sometimes there are great relationships in the community where people look after that individual, but sometimes there aren't. And if you're seeing clues in your intervention that actually they are becoming vulnerable to being targeted by others, it needs to be picked up and it needs to be run with. So today, just so happens that that family member just happened to be looking at this person's bank statements and noticed what was happening, put two and two together. Our lady couldn't remember, but actually he's managed to take it up on behalf of her, and the bank are getting involved and the police are getting involved. But it kind of brings us to the point of vulnerability and the need to advance plan and think about lasting power of attorney or appointeeships, slightly different there, for finance and property. And what you need to be aware of here is that actually, if there's somebody willing to do that, that's quite a responsibility, by the way, something that people shouldn't take lightly, is that enables you to help the individual with Huntington's disease, whilst they still have capacity to manage money, but maybe it's getting a little bit wobbly around the edges, and to safeguard them as best you can. And that's ultimately what I talked about with this family member today. I was like, okay, now I think this is, you know, the point at which maybe you need to have lasting power of attorney. And he was like, yeah, okay. So that's going to be the next step. But of course, again, as we said earlier on, sex, money, emotions, finances, driving, these are all really, really hot topics and no easy answers, but needing to be aware of them, that these happen quite frequently. Lots of folk that we have in the community, one of the first red flags is debt builds up really quickly. You've got impulsivity of behavior, you've got purchasing like your lady in Primark, you know, you've got all of that going on, and build suddenly, and of course then we've got organizational problems, so not opening mail, and suddenly there's debt collectors on the door. And it's about unraveling all of those things.
So mobility and equipment. Maintaining mobility is really important. So if you look at the physiotherapy guidelines for working with Huntington's disease, aerobic exercise, they've been able to demonstrate how that can improve fitness and motor function for people with Huntington's disease. So a referral to physiotherapy is really important to maintain someone's mobility. As soon
as possible, and as early as possible. Yeah.
We've talked about transitioning from driving to use of public transport, and the adjustment to that. So that's again, that's not just the mobility side of that, is in being able to step up onto a bus, being able to do the steps, to maintain your balance as the bus starts to go off and you're not sat down. But actually, it's the cognitive aspect of that. It's doing two things at once. It's getting on the bus, getting your money out, asking what you want. You know, there's so many parts to any activity, and I'm hopefully over the seminars that we've been able to talk about you know, the understanding between behavior, cognition, mobility, how it all interplays. But that's a big thing, transitioning from driving to public transport, particularly if you've always driven everywhere and that's been your you know, main mode of transport. External grabways, pathways, the community OT. I'm sure, Alex, this is something that you look at and refer out to, is looking at the home environment. Is in the external home environment, is someone able to access their threshold in out of the house safely? Are grab rails required? What are pathways? Are pathways suitable, particularly if we're starting to use mobility equipment such as walking aids or wheelchairs? Onto wheelchairs, I'm just conscious of time, so I'm running quite quickly now through these. Onto wheelchairs, referral for wheelchair, and we've talked about this before, referrals to wheelchair services, when we've talked about posture. Wheelchair services do have a very strict criteria as to whether someone will be able to be assessed and provided for a wheelchair. Generally, when someone starts to need postural support, so they might need some tilt to maintain their bottom in the back of the chair. They might need trunk support because of leaning to the left or to the right. That's the point when you're more likely to get a referral for a wheelchair accepted from wheelchair services. To access the community safely, in a wheelchair, I always recommend a belt is used. I will always have the conversation with the person using the wheelchair about why I'm recommending a belt, and that's for their safety. I'd hate to hit a bump, hit a curve, and the person fall from the chair. It's important that the person I'm speaking to understands why the belt is being put on. If they don't have capacity, then I would need to speak to family members and or the team, if I work in a team, and do a best interest decision about that. What we can't do is be restraining people with a belt. Likewise, if someone has got capacity and they choose not to wear a belt, then that's something that we'd have to do a risk assessment on. I personally wouldn't take someone out in a wheelchair in transport if they're not putting on the belts for their own safety, you know, the seat belts. And if I was putting at that point, I'd want a belt around their waist as well. So it's thinking about risk assessment and someone's capacity and what's in their best interest.
I mean, then there's a marked difference between restraint and safety. So, and there is actually a legal definition of that, which you might be interested, everyone, to look up. Moving on, though, I think we're on the last one here. I think what we're saying is access. Adapt the activity for safety and success in participation. And one of the massive things here is, okay, this person they don't have that much energy, so we've got to think about timing, we've got to think about when, where, how much, grading, all of those kinds of things. Not this completion of an activity equals success. Part of an activity might be enough. Scope the venue, liaise with the venue if a person has capacity, can consent to that. But if not, okay, work through your capacity, work through your risk assessment. And again, be aware of what might happen. Chances are that most things you thought through, but there's always going to be something. It has to be like a well-oiled machine, I find. Consider the demands of being able to access outside. Kirsty said about posture is really, really important. You know, that person sat in a pub, but they haven't got postural support, but they're drinking a pint of beer. You know, how can that be done? How can that be done so that fatigue is reduced? How can that be done so that the swallow is successful? Lots and lots of fine detail, which are usually really worth thinking through. Consider the recovery from the activity, and this is about fatigue management, because again, we're running a marathon a day, that person is running 3 or 4 marathons a day. So actually one activity every few days with regular rest breaks is totally fine. And then the other thing here is actually, you know, I mentioned people not going out because actually they've been accused of being drunk, for example. The HDAs, ID badges are absolutely fantastic. And this says, you know, I have Huntington's disease and this is the way that I am because. And engage people. If you're a companion, if you're a carer, if you're a person with Huntington's disease, engage people. Most people are okay with that. I think is it.